The ending didn't announce itself with the developer's bulldozer permit. It arrived quietly, like the first frost on a leaf, months earlier when Elias began whispering to the orchids as he watered them at dawn, speaking not just to the plants, but to every season this soil had witnessed. When the official letter finally arrived that cool October morning, Evergreen Haven Nursery must close its gates at the end of the growing season due to land acquisition for commercial development. The greenhouse seemed to exhale a long, humid sigh. Elias was already inside, as always, moving between the rows with the same weathered hands that had coaxed 3 generations of families through weddings, funerals, and new beginnings, using nothing but soil and patience. Keep the roots strong for whoever still needs beauty today, he said softly as Lila, Marcus, and Sophie gathered near the propagation tables. His voice carried the quiet steadiness of someone who had spent decades teaching people how to grow through their grief. For Elias, this nursery had never been just a business. It was where life and death danced together under glass, where people learned that even the most fragile things could bloom again. You plant, you tend, you endure. Lila sat on the overturned clay pot near the ferns, the steady center of their small crew. She watched how the filtered morning light caught the deep lines around Elias's eyes and remembered mornings when these gatherings were filled with excited plans for new hybrids or laughter about customers who named their plants after lost loved ones. Today they weren't discussing soil mixes or seasonal displays. They were standing in the slow withering of something none of them had ever imagined could be uprooted. Marcus leaned against the potting bench, trying to keep his usual gardener's easy humor alive. His jokes came more carefully now, his eyes drifting to Elias, like he was waiting for the man who had quietly paid for his mother's funeral flowers 5 years ago, to finally show the first sign of wilting. Sophie stayed standing by the ancient rose trellis, the anchor. She carried the printed development plans like fragile seedlings, her gaze never leaving Elias. She was watching for the moment the man who had taught them all how to nurture life through the hardest winters, who had become the town's quiet grandfather after his wife passed 12 years ago, might finally bend. The unspoken pact among them was simple. Nobody asks Elias how the soil feels beneath his feet right now. They all knew he had been here longest. They all knew these greenhouses weren't just glass and steel. They were the only true home he had left. By the time the first customer stepped through the gravel path, the nursery felt both overflowing with life and hollow with impending silence. They moved through the humid aisles together, the scent of damp earth and living green clinging to their skin like memory. Elias paused beside the old magnolia tree that had stood at the center since 1995, one rough hand resting on its bark as if listening to its pulse. "We still have one season," he murmured, almost to the leaves above. "That's enough time to make every bloom matter." Lila glanced at Marcus and Sophie. None of them challenged him, but something in Elias's quiet voice told them this wasn't only about giving the town one last beautiful spring. The nursery didn't feel like it was dying that morning. It felt like it was waiting for Elias to decide exactly how its final garden would grow. The weeks that followed felt like watching a garden slowly surrender to the first hard frost. Leaves curling at the edges, colors bleeding into brown. The whole living tapestry losing its green one breath at a time. Seed trays emptied faster than they could be refilled. The propagation benches grew quiet as the last cuttings were claimed by regulars who couldn't say the word goodbye. The old misting system hissed more than it whispered, and no one bothered adjusting the timers anymore. Evergreen Haven Nursery was going dormant, one wilting stem at a time. Elias never named the chill. He simply arrived at 5:45 a.m. each morning, the same faded canvas apron tied tight, soil under his nails, moving between the rows with the patient rhythm of someone who had coaxed life from barren ground for decades. But the others noticed. He stayed long after the gates closed, the greenhouse lights glowing until the valley outside went dark and still. Lila would catch the soft amber haze through the fogged glass on her way home. Elias's silhouette bent low over something that definitely wasn't tomorrow's order list. She never asked. None of them did. The pact still held. Nobody asks Elias how the soil feels beneath his feet right now. Then came the first quiet fracture. It was a Thursday, right after the final autumn plant sale. Only 9 customers had come. Marcus was loading the last of the empty pots into the truck when Elias stepped out from the propagation house, carrying a small wooden crate wrapped in burlap. The old gardener looked smaller in the slanting golden light filtering through the glass panes, yet his shoulders still carried the same steady strength that had once helped Marcus replant both his mother's grave and his own shattered life 5 years earlier. "Walk with me," Elias said. They stopped beside Marcus's battered pickup at the edge of the gravel lot. Elias pressed the crate into his hands. "Open it when the wind stops whispering through the leaves. Not here." Marcus waited until he was parked under the old oak at the end of the lane, engine off, windows down. Inside, the burlap rested a perfectly grafted young apple tree, rare heirloom variety, roots already reaching, the kind of living legacy that would bear fruit for generations. Tied to the trunk with garden twine was a small brass tag engraved. Marcus Vale, evergreen forever, every seed you helped me save. Beneath the tree lay an envelope, a cashier's check for $8,700, exactly the amount Marcus had quietly borrowed from Elias 3 years ago to cover the funeral costs that had nearly broken him. The note, written in Elias's careful, soil-stained hand, read simply, "You repaid me with every late-night watering you stayed for when a customer needed hope more than flowers. Debt dissolved, plant this where it can grow wild. The earth deserves your hands again." Marcus sat on the tailgate for 20 minutes, fingers buried in the damp soil around the roots until the check fluttered like a fallen leaf, and the numbers blurred with something warmer than dew. Elias lived on a gardener's modest wages in the same small cottage behind the nursery he and his late wife had built in 1998. Where had this come from? That same night, the four of them drifted back into the greenhouse anyway, the first time since the closure letter. Sophie had been cross-referencing the final inventory ledgers. Lila was pretending to label the last seed packets. Elias arrived last, carrying a stack of old customer garden journals bound with twine. Sophie couldn't hold the silence anymore. "Elias, what are you doing?" He set the journals down as gently as if they were still damp with morning mist. "I am closing the garden properly." Lila's voice cracked first. "Marcus showed us the tree. The check. You've been working in the back every night, grafting rare roses, boxing heirloom tools, collecting pressed flowers with names written in the margins. You're not donating them to the county. You're giving them away." Elias met each of their eyes beneath the soft glow of the greenhouse lamps. The humid air hummed overhead, like it always had, but tonight the sound felt like a held breath before the first hard freeze. "I started saving the month I first broke ground here," he said quietly. "Every small raise, every weekend landscaping job, every unexpected royalty from the seed catalogs. Ruth and I never had children. This nursery became our child. 27 years of watching the three of you walk in as uncertain young hands and grow into the kind of gardeners who can coax life from stone. 27 years of giving families who were told their grief would never bloom again. One more season of color. I kept a separate account. I called it the Afterbloom Fund." He rested a palm on the stack of journals. "These last months, I'm not letting this place go fallow like it never held life. Every soul who ever planted here is receiving something that proves their roots mattered. Every one of you is receiving what I owe you for keeping me growing after Ruth died. I'm not seeking approval. I'm simply tending the final harvest." The greenhouse fell into a silence so complete the distant wind outside sounded like a distant rustle in another garden. For the first time since the letter, someone had named the ache they'd all been trying to mulch over. Elias wasn't merely losing a nursery. He was burying the only family he had left. Marcus's fingers tightened around the small brass tag in his pocket. Lila pressed her palms to her eyes. Sophie removed her glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose until the numbers stopped blurring. No one spoke for a long time. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was rich with every seed they had finally been allowed to feel taking root. The final weeks of Evergreen Haven Nursery felt like the garden itself, drawing its last deep breath before winter. Colors still vivid, but the edges already curling inward, the soil growing cooler and quieter beneath every footstep, as if the earth knew the time for blooming was almost over. Every day carried another small withering, The seed catalogues were boxed and sent away. The propagation tables stood half bare, their plastic trays stacked like forgotten promises. The misting system dripped more than it sprayed, and no one bothered recalibrating the timers anymore. Even the gravel paths seemed to forget the sound of footsteps. Fewer visitors paused to touch the leaves. Fewer hands lingered on the bark. Families moved through the greenhouses with a strange mix of reverence and sorrow, like they knew they were the last ones who would ever smell this particular blend of loam and living hope. Elias moved through the fading green like a gardener who had already seen the final harvest in his dreams and was now only pruning the invisible branches no one else could see. He began arriving before the first bird stirred, sometimes at 4:20 a.m., when the glass panes were still blind with night dew. The night watchman swore the soft glow of the work lamps was already on when he made his rounds, and the faint scent of fresh compost hung in the air like a secret. Lila started noticing delicate miracles left on doorsteps or tucked into mailboxes. A young widow who had lost her husband in spring found a perfectly grafted lilac bush with a small tag that read, "Your love always bloomed longer than anyone gave it credit for. Keep tending. E." A quiet teenager who dreamed of becoming a botanist opened a plain envelope to find a rare heirloom seed collection, each packet labeled in Elias's steady hand with the plant's future name. These weren't casual gestures, they were living legacies, thoughtful, precise, costly in ways only decades of quiet saving could explain. Each one a root system reaching forward into someone else's tomorrow. One afternoon, Sophie finally shattered the humid quiet behind the potting bench. "He's spending everything," Sophie said, voice low and soil soft. "I checked the accounts. Elias emptied his entire retirement fund last month. Every cent. He told the advisor he didn't need the pension because he wasn't going to live long enough to draw it anyway." Marcus's face went pale as winter mulch. "He lied." "He didn't lie," Lila whispered. "He just decided. He said he was moving closer to family, but he has no family left. That night they found him." The greenhouse lamps were still burning at 9:28 p.m., and Elias stood surrounded by dozens of carefully wrapped bundles tied with garden twine. Old customer journals with handwritten letters folded between pressed petals. Grafted fruit trees with names etched into the bark. Even the weathered evergreen haven, established 1995, sign that had hung above the entrance for 20 years, had been gently restored and framed like a family portrait. Elias didn't startle when the three of them filled the doorway. He simply brushed the soil from his hands. Leela spoke first, her voice trembling like a leaf in the first frost. "Elias, what are you doing? Truly?" He lowered himself onto the edge of the old potting bench, the same scarred wooden surface where he had taught countless hands that gardening was just another word for second chances. "I'm making sure this nursery doesn't go fallow without a proper harvest," he said. "Every soul who ever planted here is receiving something that proves their roots mattered. I've been tracking them down for months, Old order slips, emails, families who still remember the smell of the blooms. Some are master gardeners now. Some are still struggling. Some gave up and became accountants. They're all getting something living from this soil before the gates lock forever. Marcus stepped closer. You cashed out your retirement, all of it. Elias offered a small, tired smile that smelled faintly of turned earth and rain. Ruth and I always said this nursery was our greatest growing season. I don't need money where I'm going. I need to know I left something behind that no bulldozer or new parking lot can erase when they pave this land in September. Sophie's voice cracked like a dry stem. And where exactly are you going, Elias? For the first time, he looked away, toward the dark glass panes, as if seeing mountains that weren't there. He reached into the drawer and pulled out a single plane ticket. One way, dated for the day after the final closing. I bought a small plot of untouched meadow in the high hills of New Zealand. Nothing grand, just enough space for a wild garden and the sound of wind through native grasses. I'm going to plant it myself. And on the day they lock these gates for the last time, I'm going to disappear. No forwarding address, no farewell open house. I don't want anyone feeling sorry for me. I just want to go somewhere the soil has never known concrete, where I can remember what this nursery felt like when it was alive with growing things. The three of them stood motionless, the greenhouse air suddenly heavy as wet compost. This was the plan. Not just gifts, not just tidy closure. Elias had decided to vanish along with every root the nursery had ever held. Lila felt the ground tilt beneath her, as if the entire garden of their lives had just been lifted from its bed. You were going to disappear without telling us, she whispered. Elias looked at each of them, eyes reflecting the lamplight, with something between hard-won peace and a sorrow too deep for any soil to hold. I thought it would be kinder that way. The greenhouse fell silent, except for the soft drip of the misting system that would soon be turned off forever. For the first time, the unspoken pact lay scattered like fallen petals across the floor, and none of them knew how to gather the pieces without crushing what was left. The final day of Evergreen Haven Nursery arrived like the last golden hour of autumn. Warm light spilling across the beds, leaves still clinging with stubborn beauty, yet every breeze carrying the unmistakable promise of the coming frost. The closing celebrations spilled out of the greenhouses and into the open garden beds, because the developers had already begun staking survey lines along the perimeter. The display tables stood mostly bare, their remaining pots arranged like quiet mourners. Many families had already moved on emotionally, carrying their final plants home like living keepsakes. But the customers and students who lingered carried something different in their eyes. They knew they were witnessing the last harvest this soil would ever give. Elias stood at the center of the old magnolia bed in his usual soil-stained apron, the one he had worn through every season for 27 years. He didn't give a speech, he never did, but every single person who came that day received something deeply personal from him. Some found handwritten growing instructions tucked into clay pots. Others received rare grafted saplings, with decades of careful notes pressed into the bark. One young mother who had planted a memorial rose for her stillborn child discovered the exact same rose variety, now 20 years mature and blooming, carefully dug, root ball wrapped, and engraved on a brass tag with her daughter's name and the words, "She was always meant to keep growing beyond what we could see." By the time the last visitor walked the gravel path into the dusk, the truth had begun to spread through the garden, like mycelium beneath the soil, quiet, unstoppable, connecting everything. Elias had spent every dollar he possessed. Lila, Marcus, and Sophie watched from the edges as former customers approached him one by one, many openly crying, clutching bundles and pots they had received in the mail over the past weeks. A retired landscaper showed off the heirloom fruit tree Elias had sent. A single father revealed the window box herb garden he'd received with a note saying, "Your family still deserves to taste hope." The four of them finally cornered Elias in the quiet propagation house once the gates were locked for good. The space was almost completely bare now. Only the old wooden potting bench remained, still bearing the faint green stains of 1,000 seedlings coaxed into life. Sophie spoke first, her voice thick as fresh compost. "You sold the cottage behind the nursery too, didn't you?" Elias didn't deny it. He simply nodded once, the gesture as final as pruning the last dead branch. "I kept enough for the meadow in New Zealand and basic tools to start a wild garden. The rest, I made certain it went where it truly belonged." Marcus's hands trembled at his sides, still smelling of the apple tree's damp roots. "Do you have any idea what you've done? You gave away your life savings, your retirement, your home, everything you had." Elias looked at the three of them with the calmest, clearest eyes they had ever seen. Eyes that had spent a lifetime teaching others how to see life, even in the hardest ground. "I had 27 years inside these walls of glass and green," he said softly. 27 years of watching all of you grow right alongside every seed that ever broke through this soil. I watched Lila learn how to fight for every fragile thing that needed light. I watched Marcus become the kind of gardener who pulls beauty from rock bottom. I watched Sophie turn from a nervous first year into the best damn steward this nursery ever had. I watched thousands of souls leave here, rooted deeper than when they arrived, carrying life they didn't know they could still hold. He turned toward the empty bench and gently traced the faint green stains that would never be fully scrubbed away. "This nursery raised me after Ruth died. It gave me purpose when my own roots felt torn. How could I walk away and let every living thing vanish, as if none of it had ever grown? I didn't give those people my money. I gave them proof that someone believed in their seasons, that this soil believed in them. Lila stepped forward, tears tracing warm paths down her cheeks like rain on new leaves. You were going to disappear. You were going to leave us without saying goodbye. After everything, you were simply going to let the garden go silent. Elias's voice finally cracked, the first time any of them had ever heard the man who taught patience break. I thought if I slipped away quietly, none of you would have to carry the weight of me. I didn't want to become another empty bed in a year that had already taken everything we loved. The propagation house fell silent. Then Marcus did something none of them expected. He crossed the damp concrete floor and pulled the older man into a fierce embrace, the kind of hug that held every unsaid season, every shared sunrise watering, every tear hidden behind a smile. "You stubborn old root," Marcus whispered, voice raw as fresh-turned earth. "You were never a weight. You were the reason we kept growing through the hardest winters." Lila and Sophie joined them. The four of them stood wrapped together in the near-empty greenhouse, holding the man who had tried to give every last seed of himself away, so no one else would feel the cold. That was the moment it truly broke them open. Not the nursery closing, not the lost land or the coming bulldozers. It was realizing that Elias had spent his final months trying to make sure no one would miss him, while quietly becoming the deepest root in every life he had ever touched. In the end, they let him go. They helped him pack the last crates of tools and seeds, drove him to the airport, and watched his plane disappear into the southern sky. But they refused to let the garden die with the land. They bought every remaining heirloom seed and sapling Elias had set aside. Then they founded the Evergreen Seed Collective, a traveling network of community gardens and seed libraries that followed the seasons across the country. Every year on the anniversary of the nursery's closing, they planted a new public garden wherever Elias happened to be living that season. He would join them from his meadow in New Zealand, sometimes by video, sometimes in person. His hands still covered in the same familiar soil. Elias never returned to the old valley. But every time a new garden bloomed in a forgotten corner of a city or a small town, the plants carried his signature, strong, generous, and quietly defiant. Because some roots cannot be uprooted. They simply learn to grow somewhere else and teach the rest of us how to follow.